The winner getting a shot at either Duran or more. Resto was backed by veteran coach Panama Lewis. Collins' corner was a family affair. His old man had guided him to an undefeated pro record. His father, who'd once dreamt of his own victory in the ring, dreams he now focused on his son.
He was on his way to becoming a contender. When he stepped into the ring, he had the personality, the charisma, the karma that the fans just really eat up.
If there's any edge at all, I would have to give it to Collins. I think he takes a little bit better punch than Louis Resto, and I think he punches a little harder with one punch.
It would, in fact, be a punch-drunk night, with the consequences landing far beyond the ropes. But the seeds of how Collins would handle himself were sown long ago in Tennessee.
I preached to him all as a little boy. Never quit in a fight, never showed afraid, and always be game and courageous.
Billy grew up on the outskirts of Nashville. His father was a truck driver, his battered nose the only remnant of his career in the ring. From the time Billy was 10, Collins Sr. had him sparring. He trained in a ring on the poor side of town.
When I first met him and started going out with him, he wouldn't take me in his house. And he would make up excuse. I mean, he'd always have an excuse for something. But then finally, you know, after we had been together once, I was just embarrassed. I don't want anybody to know how I lived. The floor was dirt. I mean, it was the bottom of the barrel.
The only person to ever challenge this father-son dream was a 17-year-old girl named Andrea.
His father told him to never marry me. He was afraid that getting married would ruin his career.
When Billy Ray Collins entered the ring with Louis Resto, Andrea was home in Nashville 9 months pregnant. It was just another fight, and she had every expectation that he would win. He had been undefeated, so she barely watched the rounds as they were broadcast on TV.
It was a very rough physical fight, and in the early rounds there was no sign that Billy was headed for disaster. But as the fight wore on, his face began to bruise up. Every time he got hit by Louis Resto, it was like Resto's fist left an impression.
But these are the kind of punches, Tim, that can be detrimental to a fighter's career.
And after a while, the cheekbones and the eyelids and all around this whole area just began to blow up and turn purple. And you could see that something severe was happening.
At the end of the fight, as Billy lurched around the ring, even the sport commentators were beginning to think something was terribly wrong.
I mean, Collins taking some heavy punishment here. I feel the fight should be stopped.
The brawl between Resto and Collins went the full 10 rounds. It wasn't a fight, it was a massacre. But after 30 minutes and 450 punches to the head, Billy was still standing.
He called me after the fight, and he said that he had been beat up. He hung up, and then he called back 30 minutes later, and he was crying, and he said, I've been beat up bad. You don't realize how bad I've been beat up. He said, I'm blind, I can't see, and I think I'm going to die.
It was Billy's dad, the man who'd spent 10 years building his son's career, who was the first to discover Louis Resto's gloves were missing 1/3 of their padding. Unpadded, Resto's gloves became lethal weapons, causing permanent damage to Billy's eyes. He would never fight again. Billy's 30 minutes in the ring brought 8 years of court battles, and some contend his death.
How hard did he try to win? Fighting a man with bad knuckles. 2 rounds. That's how hard he tried to win.
This is what we know of what Billy was thinking from an interview he gave after the fight in Nashville.
It seemed like every time he hit me, you know, I could feel knots come on my head, and my eyes already started to swell about the 4th, 5th round, and I just couldn't figure it out. And he was some good body shots, and I'd never been hit like that before in my life, and I just thought something there. You know, I didn't really think, and I just kept on trying to do my job.
As a result of the fight, an investigation was held. It revealed that weeks before the event, a meeting took place above this restaurant. Present were Louis Resto's manager, Panama Lewis, and a cocaine dealer named Mario Di Garcia.
Mr. Lewis was overheard telling this person that he was going to pull the stuffing out of the gloves to give Louis Resto a better punch.
Tampering would have been terrible enough, but some suspect there was an even darker motive. Denny Burlington spent months researching the story for a screenplay.
I suspect that there were heavy bets made on a knockout, on a win, and that someone somewhere decided, hey, if we can't on this guy, let's make some money on him and get rid of him.
The night of the fight, Prosecutor Wilson says this is what happened during a 15-minute time frame when there were no boxing inspectors in Resto's room.
So what did he actually do?
What we found out was that Panama Lewis went into the men's room and cut holes in the gloves of Louis Resto. They removed about an ounce of horsehair from the inside of the gloves, from the punching surface, and then discarded virtually all of the horsehair inside that toilet.
Ripping out the padding. A little bit more, and it's right in that. Now, that was less than about 20 seconds. Now he goes and he does the other glove.
Shouldn't somebody have been responsible for checking those gloves?
Back in 1983, before I was in charge of the commission, the glove man hired by the promoter was. And apparently what he did, he gave the gloves to the camp of Louis Resto and Panama Lewis, perhaps before he should have.
Unbelievably, at that time, the inspectors were not required to touch the gloves once they were on the boxer's hands. Louis Resto and Panama Lewis were indicted by a federal grand jury. They were sentenced to less than 3 years in prison. Charges were dropped against the glove inspectors, and Billy's family received no compensation. They lost more than money. They lost Billy himself.
After he got back, things started getting worse and worse between us. He started hitting me a lot, and he would cry for days. He did drugs, he drank.
Andrea says the last night of Billy's life, he fought the man who taught him how. The fight was over her, the one thing to come between himself and Collins Sr.
Well, Billy loved his father, but he never really stood up to him. I think that night, what they were arguing about, Billy stood up to his father.
Drunk and angry, Billy drove away into a ditch, known in the area for the past 100 years as Collins Creek.
He had a pauper's funeral. We had boxers coming from Hawaii. We had boxers coming from everywhere. It was a huge funeral.
Screenwriter Susan Sachs tells Collins Sr.'s side of the story.
Does he take any responsibility for what happened to his son in the ring?
Oh, he feels awful about it. He feels terrible. He feels a tremendous amount of guilt, and, you know, hindsight is always better than foresight.
Mr. Collins was not willing to speak with us about this issue, but Billy's mother had this to say in an interview in 1984.
I asked him, I said, Ray, why in the world didn't you get your daddy to stop that fight? And he told me, he said, Mama, I'd rather die than stop that fight.
Yeah, I think he should have stopped it. But, you know, I mean, he was the manager and the trainer. He was the professional there, not me. I know what I saw.
Andrea has a more frightening explanation for why Billy went round after round against Resto. It goes back to his childhood when his father trained fighting pit bulls.
When Billy was young, his father trained dogs to be fierce. Billy was trained in the same way to be fierce, to fight to the death.
This is a story without any silver lining. Panama Lewis, Louis Resto's trainer and the man held responsible for actually taking out the stuffing, has been relicensed in Pennsylvania, and he is now helping to train Mike Tyson. Don King, Tyson's promoter, refused to allow me to speak with Panama Lewis. New York Boxing Commissioner Randy Gordon says Lewis will never get a license in New York, however, while he remains the commissioner.
This is a sad story. Does the family have any additional plans to pursue this further in court?
Absolutely. They are locked in battle, and their next bout begins in the Court of Claims. Last spring, a federal civil suit ended in a hung jury. They are trying to sue for damages and lost wages, and they are suing the New York Boxing Commission. But the commissioner contends that his inspectors under the old rules didn't have to touch those gloves once they were on Louis Resto's hands. Those rules, of course, have been changed now, but that won't do the family any good.
Thanks, Taryn. Not exactly a ringing endorsement.
Continuing our look at the world of boxing, we're going to focus more closely now on the one man who probably has more power than any other person in the sport. We're not talking about power in the ring, but power outside the ring. Don King's trademark haircut may make him seem like a cartoon character. There's nothing funny about his clout in the industry. In this week's Sports Illustrated, New York State Inspector General Joseph Spinelli reveals a long-buried probe into King's and boxing's alleged connections to the underworld. In the article, Spinelli tells of King's meeting with known mobster Michael Franchese and others with underworld connections. Joseph Spinelli joins us now here in our studio. Welcome to The Real Story. That story that we saw just earlier with Billy Ray Collins, you were there at that fight.
I was at the Billy Collins fight. It was an undercard fight to the Roberto Duran-Davey Moore fight.
Panama Red, as we mentioned, who was the manager of the other fighter, went to prison, is now getting...
Panama Lewis,
is getting his license back. Does that tell you that boxing needs some kind of overall control instead of, I don't know how many different organizations there are, the WBC and the WBA and all of these?
Well, you have four governing bodies right now. You have the WBC, WBA, IBF, and the WBO. And the point I wrote this article in the Sports Illustrated last week was explicitly to illustrate and accentuate the need for a National Boxing Commission. Having watched the Billy Collins piece, I think adds more credence to the need for a national commission to govern the sport in a cohesive way more than anything else.
Do the organizations that are out there now in charge, those four various governing bodies, actually control it, or do powerful promoters like Don King tell their particular organization what to do, and they basically echo the promoter's desires?
Yeah, it's a well-known fact that not just Don King, but Don King with the WBC, Bob Arum with the WBA, and now Dan Duva, who controls the heavyweight champion of the world, Evander Holyfield, have aligned themselves with various organizations. And what that does is it affords them the opportunity to make certain that various fighters are ranked, and therefore they can make certain that their champion gets the championship fights with these fighters.
It also they determine who gets to be the referee, who gets to be the judges at the fights.
That's correct.
And when you see decisions that you wonder, now how did they come to that conclusion? Which I saw recently in a fight involving, I think, a fighter from, I don't even remember the names, but the point is it was so clearly that this Australian fighter had won and they declared it a draw.
You're talking about Jeff Finich when he fought Azuma Nelson.
And I saw Don King get into the ring and say, the great thing about this, we've got to have a rematch. He was only looking at the dollars to make out of another fight that he could promote, right?
I think that's a fair assumption, yes.
Well, Don King's organizations, in your article in Sports Illustrated, go far beyond just the WBC and stretch right into organized crime. You were with the FBI running an undercover investigation, and what did you find out?
During the course of our undercover operation, which was codenamed Crown Royal, we had a then capo in the Colombo crime family, Michael Franchese, take us into a meeting. We take our undercover FBI agent into a meeting into Don King Productions to discuss with Don King the possibility of doing a co-promotion.
And in the article you reveal you talked to other mobsters without them knowing who you were, or your undercover agent knowing who he was. And they all seemed to just confirm this idea that Don King was connected.
Well, what they confirmed was not only that they could take us into Don King, but they said they could take us to a variety of people who could make certain that their fighters would be moved along to a championship fight, and that we, in fact, would be in a position to do co-promotions with these people because of who we knew.
What does Don King get out of a connection with organized crime, if that still holds true?
I really don't know that to be true one way or the other, and I really don't want to speculate.
They were just good friends, is what you do know for sure.
Well, what we do know is that we were, in fact, brought into a meeting, into his very office, by a then capo in the Colombo crime family.
What's the advantage? Who gets the advantage? If something like that were true, whether it's Don King or anybody else, what advantage is it for the mob and what advantage is it for the promoter?
Well, the mob is going to make money in getting involved in boxing, not in fixed fights anymore. I think, as Michael Franchese stated to us in the article, he spoke to Sports Illustrated for some 3 hours, and he stipulated that the way they make money is through closed-circuit productions, where they may get a certain area, and they would be responsible for all the closed-circuit sites. And it's a tremendous amount of money and revenues that are garnered every year from professional boxing.
And what does the promoter get? He just gets a cash
gets a percentage.
Influx?
He gets a percentage of that also.
In this investigation, you also found that a respected name, Jersey Joe Walcott, former champion, was taking money. In this case, you do actually know because he took money from your people to arrange a license to fight in New Jersey. Did you find that pretty common, that right from the top on down that there was corruption, people to be bought? deals to be had?
I can't say I found it common because I can't enumerate on the amount of incidents that occurred during the investigation, but what I can say is that all of the things you're talking about, all the different types of atrocities that exist in professional boxing, accentuate the need for a National Boxing Commission. And that's what I'm here to do, and any way I can do it, I'm going to try.
Do you think the public really cares, or do they just sort of assume that when you say that boxing has shady characters, that people go, so what? We expect that, and we just assume that's true.
I think there's even a greater need for a National Boxing Commission because of that perception. People who follow sports, they don't have that perception of professional baseball or basketball or football, and it's not coincidental that those particular sports are regulated by a commission, a national commission, that makes certain that these types of atrocities don't occur. I don't think the perception would be out there that boxing is unsavory if there was a commission.
And what we do know about Don King is that he has managed fighters on the side while promoting them, which is against the law.
Well, I think...
At least it's indicated with Larry Holmes that he was taking a percentage even if through the back door.
We received information that Larry Holmes was only receiving 50% of his purses, but I think the greatest atrocity that I feel I uncovered wasn't even during the FBI investigation. It was while I was the New York State Inspector General when I investigated the Tim Witherspoon, James Bolden Crusher Smith fight and found that both fighters weren't licensed in the state of New York at the time of the fight. They were both managed by the same individual, Carl King.
Don King's son.
And who was negotiating with his stepfather, Don King, on behalf of both fighters. That's the most blatant conflict of interest I've ever uncovered.
We're going to have to wrap it up here, Joseph Spinelli, but obviously boxing does need someone at the top to straighten out this mess. Thank you very much for joining us on The Real Story. That's it for this half hour. Still ahead tonight.